In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how using the compositor can improve your final renderings. I'm going to show you how it is that we can go from this through a progression of steps to finally get to this final rendering, which looks really nice. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start off by taking a look at this scene, and I want to show you how simple this scene is. We have a backdrop that has a simple material that's got a base color. It's simply a diffuse material. And then we've got a ground that's another simple material. The only difference is that I have a specular component to produce a little bit of reflections, although we don't see them a lot here. The wine bottle itself has a glass material. In fact, let's switch over to shading and we can look at this in a node setup a little bit easier. The glass has a simple white color for the base color. That's going to make the glass completely transparent. And then we have transmission set to 1.0, so it's completely transparent. The index of refraction of 1.52 is the default, and it needs to remain that way. That's the common glass index of refraction. If we take a look at the material on the inside, which is the liquid, then we have a similar type of material where in this particular case, I've got the base color still set to white, and we have transmission set to 1.0, which is what we would expect, but the index of refraction has been lowered to 1.33, which is much more consistent of a liquid. If we pull back out, we can see that I have a volume absorption attached to the volume of the material output. And that's what gives us the coloration for the wine. And the setup is exactly the same for the wine glasses. Let's take a look now at the light. Pull back out and we'll take a look at this. This area light is the sole source of illumination in this scene. It has been set up to have light output and emission, which these are the default nodes that you get, but I've added a little bit of coloration with the black body node. 4500 is going to give it a little bit of warmth. So let's take a look at this. If I simply come over to the camera, and let's just take a look at this. You can see a little bit of warmth in this scene. If I take this node and turn it off, the color of the light is just this bland neutral white, and that's not what I wanted. I want a little bit of warmth to it, which is very typical of many lights. The other thing that we're going to take note is the fact that my strength on this emission node is 1, but when we come down and take a look at the light properties, come up to the top, we note that the power is 5 watts. So if you're using an area light, if you're using any of these lights, it's best to set the power and leave the emission node strength at 1 because this acts as a multiplier. So now we're really going to start our discussion that goes over the lighting and the way that the rendering is handling this, because when we see this render, it doesn't look very good actually. We're going to be discussing color management. So what we need to do is come up to the top where we have render properties and then shift all the way down to the bottom to the color management tab. And the first thing that we're going to note is currently I have the display set to sRGB, which is standard. That's the default. And it's no different than if you're working in Photoshop, the final rendered pixels are being displayed in the sRGB color space. But underneath that, we also have view transform. Let me pull this out a little bit so we can see that. View transform is very important here. What it does is it takes the image pixels after they have been rendered and adjusts them to be within a certain range, if you want to think about it that way. When we look here, we can see some areas that are clearly blown out. If we come and look at the rendering from the top, we see the light's proximity relative to the scene. It's pretty close, and we have pretty rapid fall off. So this is the inverse square law manifesting itself. We don't necessarily want those blown out areas, and we want to figure out how to have some contrast between the light areas and the dark areas, but we don't like the blowout. So the view transform takes these rendered pixels and it tries to move everything softly, if you want to think about it that way, into the visible color gamut range of the display. Typically in 8-bit space, we have 0 to 255, where 255 is white and 0 is black. Now, we also live in a day and age where we have 16-bit color, where the range is 0 to like 65,000, but 65,000 is still white and 0 is still black. But we also then have floating point color, which contains not only black to white, but it also contains stops of color and brightness intensity information that go well above that. And the render pipeline, as it's being calculated by cycles and by all renderers, can easily produce intensity that goes way above what we think of as white. And that's the information that view transform deals with. All of that information that is exceeding that white level that we are seeing on the screen. And it gently brings that back down. So Filmic is the standard that Blender has had for a while. So when we turn that on, we can see that data get transformed and moved down into the gamut range of the display. Now we still have a white highlight here, so that was apparently hotter than the reflections that we were seeing here. But let's back up now and let's go one step even further in kind of understanding this from a theoretical standpoint. So let's come over now and let's remove Filmic and we're going to go back to standard. Standard means no view transform. It just displays the rendered pixels as they come to us as they've been adjusted by the sRGB color. But if we want to even take that step off and we want to remove display device to none, then it looks crazy. It looks dark and muddled and contrasty. It definitely doesn't look pretty to our eyes. But it turns out that this is actually what's being rendered in the render pipeline. The render calculations, the light transport mechanisms, are actually calculating light according to physics as they've been measured in laboratories, and the equations are understood very, very well. And it's weird to think about it, but this is what the physics of light is actually doing. Our eyes and our brain are calibrating light for us to see them in a way that allows us to see darker regions better than if we were just seeing light exactly as it occurred in physics. So our visual system is biased so that we can see dark better. Well, it turns out that we need to do what's called gamma correction in order for this to look correct to our eyes. And when we switch over to sRGB, sRGB automatically applies what we call a 2.2 gamma adjustment to the image, and that is what brings it into a visual that allows us to see it correctly. When you go out with your iPhone or a digital camera and you take a picture, that camera is automatically applying a 2.2 gamma correction. Our brain does something equivalent to about a 2.2 gamma correction to an image, and that's what makes it lighter, and it allows the darker parts to become more apparent and natural looking to us. So when we come back down to color management, we look at it, view transform and below, all the settings below, affect the rendering after the pixels have been calculated by the renderer and are done in the render pipeline. Whereas if we change sRGB to something else, it needs to re-render because the rendering is taking into account the sRGB color space. So when we switch back on Filmic, which is going to try and bring all those overblown areas down into gamut, well, we run into this issue now where the image looks kind of flat. And this is where you kind of want to think about the usage of Filmic. It's on by default, but when you are playing with intensity of lights in your scene, you want to necessarily sometimes come in and turn it off to see if you have these overblown out areas. Because when Filmic is turned on, if I come over to my light and I just start continuing to increase its intensity, Filmic is going to essentially be fighting your attempts to increase light into the scene. So this is our jumping off point in understanding how the Compositing tab can help us. So the next thing that we want to understand is that the render pipeline is calculating color information in what we call high precision floating point color. It's not just plotting 8-bit pixels. Like if you go into Photoshop and you try and adjust an image that has just 8 bits of information per channel, you know that you can run into color adjustment problems, especially on the low end. Renderers actually calculate in what we call floating point color, where the color is calculated in floating point values that are incredibly fine, and each RGB channel, each of those three channels, uses either 16-bit floating point color or 32-bit precision floating point color, which is effectively unlimited in the color range. But the benefit of floating point color is that it contains stops of intensity that can go above white, above that 255 white value. Filmic is taking advantage of that floating point color, and that's how it's able to bring down these blown out ranges here and bring it back down into a normal, say, 8 or 16-bit integer space, where it's looking at this highest intensity of that specular, saying, okay, that's the highest intensity in this final image. We're bringing everything down from this into range, and it's giving us the look that isn't quite blown out. So that's a good thing, but now it looks a little bit dull. So now we're going to jump into the compositor, and we're going to start adjusting the image. So let's come over now to our Compositing tab, and we'll just take a look at the scene. Now, I've already turned on nodes. So if you haven't done anything yet with nodes, you just come over and you say use nodes, and you get these two nodes as your starting point. We also want to make sure that we turn on backdrop, and that's going to be important for when we actually start doing a rendering. What I've done is I've added a new panel on the bottom, and I've changed that over into the 3D viewport, and then I've enabled my camera so that we can actually see a rendering. So let's turn on the rendering preview, and we get the same thing that we had before, and this is going to be our starting point. The compositor takes the values that have been adjusted by Filmic, and the compositor is making changes to the high precision floating point color. So let's do our first thing here. Let's come over and add a node. I'm going to press Shift and A, and we're going to come down to color, and we're going to invoke color balance, and we're going to put color balance right there. Now, color balance has two modes, lift, gain, and gamma. But the one that is really cool is offset power and slope, and it essentially is just a way of adjusting dark, midtone, and bright values. So once you come over to one of these modes and you start making adjustments, you don't want to flip back over into the other mode because the values of the sliders will remain the same, but their effect is very different. So in offset power and gain, the middle one here essentially adjusts midtones. So let's see what happens if we adjust this. And we come up and we notice that nothing is happening. Well, we want to see the effect in the renderer, so we have to come down to our interactive render modes and the preview ray trace rendering, come over to the little option and come over to compositor and switch it on to always. And now we'll be able to see the effect of the compositor in real time. And this is a pretty recent new feature, and it's incredibly awesome. So as I come over and I start making these adjustments, you can see that by increasing this middle value, which is power, it's effectively making it more contrasty. It's affecting the midtone regions. You can make it brighter or you can make it darker. So the next thing we want to do is affect the lighter parts of the image, and this is where we would come over to this value and I would increase it, and look what we're doing. We're sort of restoring some intensity over into this area, and if you want to see what it looks like without it, you can just come back over here and disable it and enable it in order to see the adjustment. So I think the value that I want to use numerically, if I want to put it in, is you click this box down here and it'll tell you exactly what values. I think 1.2 for the mid ranges is good, and I think the value of 2.0 is good for this value. But the thing to note is that even though the slider is maxed out at the top, under value, you can still increase this value if you want that to go even a little bit higher. But I'm going to take that back down to 2 because I think that's a good functional value. Now, before we get going too much further, this is where we could come back and we could look at view transform. And you'll notice that we have a look right here. A look will then apply different contrasts to the data that Filmic has adjusted. And you could come back here and use this in addition to the values that you're adjusting using compositing. So for instance, if I said high contrast, do you see how that adjusted that? So just think of this as another layer or level of what you can do with the pixels. But I'm going to come back down and leave this at none because we want to focus on the compositor. I'm going to press Shift and A, and we're going to add another color balance, and I'll drop it right in between here. And in this particular case, we're going to use it in lift, gamma, and gain. And it still is using dark, mid-ranges, and lighter tones, but it adjusts them in a different way. And I think in this mode, I'm going to use gain, and I'm going to bring that up. And now you can see how I'm able to further adjust the image in a way that I really like just using that. In fact, I'm going to come here and I'm going to just go 1.3. I think that's a good value. The other really awesome thing about this is that you can add subtle coloration differences. So if I wanted to bias the color a little bit, you can see I can take these sliders. If I want it to be a little bit less warm, I could move the light values towards the blue, or I could come into the mid-tone regions and I could really change the hue shifting here and find a value that I think I really like. If I see it's a little bit too green there, I could come back and I could make it a little bit redder. It's really wonderful how you can add those subtle colorations using this color balance function. So once we're done, let's say that we've gotten this to a point that we really like. We've really adjusted the contrast and everything about it. This is where we would now come in and do a rendering. We would come in and we would look at our render values. In this particular case, let me do 150%. Get all your render settings, your sampling the way you want it. And in this particular case, I'm going to switch over and I'm going to use CPU because I want to be able to use path guiding. I use GPU during the interactive because it's faster, but for final rendering, I want the caustics to resolve a little bit more. So I'm switching over to CPU so I can use path guiding. And we would invoke and do the render image, and the render image function will begin. But as soon as you start seeing it, it won't have the compositing adjustments applied to it. It will only show the sRGB and then the filmic. But it won't be until it finishes the rendering that the compositing values get applied. And as the rendering gets close to being finished, it'll go through any denoising process that you have turned on, and then it will apply the compositing changes. And boom, there we go. Look how much more dynamic that is. Now, the interesting thing about this is we can still continue to adjust this. So let's just move this off to the side down here, and we're going to come back over and we can make adjustments. In fact, let me pull over Windows so we can kind of see over just a little bit. And we can look at it and we can say, maybe it's still a little bit too bright. We note that it says view layer down here, and this is kind of nebulous. View layer just means the final rendering that we have or whatever the current image source is. I can still come over and I can adjust this, and do you see how it's actually still adjusting that final rendering? So you can still continue to make adjustments even after it's done. And that's what's cool. But I want to show you something else that you can do, and this is something that I do all the time, is when we take a look at this. In fact, let's zoom down. It has denoised it, and sometimes the denoising just is almost too perfect for me. And I like to have a little bit of the original noise back in. Well, we can do that. I'm going to come right after the main render layers node, and you're going to note that it says image and the noisy image. And image is the final denoised image. Let's press Shift A, and we're going to do a mix node and put that right at the very beginning. And then we need to take image, which is defaulting into image 1, and we're going to mix noisy image into the second one. And then we want to set the value as a starting to something like 0.5, and it will mix the denoised with the noised image, and you'll get just a hint of the noise back in. And I like that. I think it adds something a little bit analog and organic back into the rendering. You can adjust it. If you want it to have a little bit less noise, we can take it down to 0.3. Now, the other thing that you can do, and this is important too, if you're going to be adjusting an image, it's kind of a pain to have that shuttled off to the side like that, isn't it? Well, make sure backdrop is enabled, And then we're going to add a viewer node. So Shift A, do a search for viewer, add that right here. And at the last node, we need to also tie in an image here, and then it puts the image in the background so we can have it there to make adjustments to, as opposed to just seeing it off on the side. Now press the N key here, and we're going to, let's come down to view. If I want to move it, I'm going to click it once and then just move the mouse. You can move it off to the side. You can zoom it. You can click zoom here to kind of move it down or scale it down or scale it up, depending on what it is that you want to do. And down here, I can minimize this so I can make adjustments to the image in the background using my nodes. So the great thing is, at this point, if we come back over to, say, shading, and we want to make changes to the materials, to the layout, anything that we want to do, let's say we want to make adjustments to the light, we come back up here to viewport shading and just make sure you have the compositor on automatically, and you can make adjustments and you can see the compositor already applying itself. So now you're free to make changes as you edit using these color adjustments that you've established. Let's take a look at one more thing that we can do with this, and we're going to start over with the start file right from the beginning. So we turn back on the interactive renderer, and in this particular case, let's come back down to color management, and we have Filmic, but we're going to do something that seems counterintuitive. If you're used to photography, especially high-end professional photography, they often like to use what's called log color. And we're going to switch this to Filmic log, and it's going to look really weird. It's going to look washed out and kind of flat. But it turns out this is incredibly useful for doing tone mapping and color adjustments after the fact. What this does, what log color does, is it exposes a broader range of the values of the image to the ability to be adjusted. So in a traditional 8-bit image, the darker ranges of an image have relatively few bits in which they can be adjusted. They're represented by a small number of the bits of the 8-bit, and in terms of the number of color steps above and below them, they're quite limited. They don't have many steps that represent those dark ranges. We can overcome that to a large extent with 16-bit color or floating point color, but having a log image like this gives you a lot of ability to apply different, what are called color lookup tables, or in this case, we're using the compositor to do the same thing. So what the camera has to do in traditional photography is apply a specific curve type, a logarithmic curve type that shifts the values up in such a way that tries to give those darker ranges an equal number of adjustable steps as with the midtone ranges, which in an 8-bit image has a lot more steps above and below it that it can be adjusted. And that's what log does. It essentially equalizes the range in such a way that allows you to adjust them much better. Now, in this case, we have the best of both worlds. We have log, but we also have high precision floating point color. So let's jump in and adjust this. So we're going to come back over into our Compositing tab. Let's turn on the renderer here, and we need to make sure that we have interactive compositing turned on. So now we come back and we're making sure that we have backdrop, just because at one point we're going to make a rendering and we want it to appear. We don't have a rendering to work with right now, so we're just using the interactive renderer. So Shift A, and we're going to come back to color. These are all things that you could adjust the image with, but color balance just happens to be a really, really good one. So that's what we're going to use. We're going to jump down here. Let's switch over to offset power and slope. And I usually like to start with the middle one because it tends to add the most contrast. Increasing will apply contrast. And once you get that looking about right, then we come over and we begin adjusting intensity to the lighter parts of the image. Now, this is where we could also come in and we could make slight adjustments if we wanted the tonality, the overall tonality of the image to get adjusted in one direction or another. So now we could come over and we could add, let's add, in this case, we'll do a search for contrast. So we do brightness and contrast, and I would come over to contrast here and let's put in a value of 1. We could see that apply right there. So this is where you would just come in and you would experiment with different nodes. I would come back in and do another color balance just because I like it so much. We'll leave this and lift gamma and gain and play with that. And then I could come back over to this one and maybe change that contrast to be more contrasty. These are totally up to your artistic decision what it is that you want to do. But I like this one in particular because I have a lot more contrast over in this area. So, whether you want that to be there or whether you want to bring it down is purely an artistic decision at this point. But this is one of the benefits of starting out with a logarithmically adjusted image. So let's come in now and let's add color, let's do hue and saturation. Let's add that right here. We could take saturation up to 1.3. Maybe that's a little bit too much, so let's take saturation back down to 1.2. And I think that's great. So now we come over and we start our rendering. Let me change my parameters a little bit here. And then we do our final render image. It'll begin without the compositing adjustments. That won't get applied until the rendering is finished. And then as soon as it finishes up, then it will apply the compositing adjustments. And this is where we can come in and make determinations if we need to do further changes. So we're just going to come back to Compositor. Let's come to the end of the pipeline here. Shift A, search for Viewer. Put that right there. Come to the last node, tie that in. And now we can make adjustments with it kind of in the background. So I think maybe my saturation could be just a little bit high. So we'll take that back to 1.1. And maybe my contrast is just a little bit high. So I'm going to pull that down just about like that. There we go. You would come back into your final render here and save it, and you're done. And if you need to, you can simply come back into your main scene and continue working. So I hope you found this to be a useful tutorial in knowing how to use color management and also the compositor to improve your renderings.